Good afternoon, and welcome to this National Underground Railroad Freedom Center webinar, the second of 3 virtual events in recognition of National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. My name is Jennifer Suchland. I am an associate professor at Ohio State University, and I have the privilege of serving as an ACLS Mellon Foundation Scholar and Society resident at the museum this academic year, focusing on the theme Abolition Today. I am honored to be joined by 3 outstanding speakers, Sylvia Perez, Uriel Zelaya Perez, and Dr. Annie Fukushima, to discuss farm worker rights and just food systems as an important legacy of anti-slavery and cornerstone of ending human trafficking. To kick off our conversation, I will give a brief introduction of our guests and the theme of today's webinar. The struggle for farm workers' rights has a long and vibrant history in the United States that intersects with other civil rights movements, including Black freedom struggles and Indigenous rights movements. While recent attention to human trafficking has increased awareness of the essential yet often vulnerable labor of farm workers, it is important to contextualize these more recent anti-trafficking efforts in this broader history, because migrant farm worker activism is and has been the primary engine behind advancing workers' rights in the agricultural sector. From the coalition of Mexican and Filipino American workers who led a nationwide strike of grape growers in Delano, California in 1965, and giving birth to the modern farm worker movement, to the recent fair food boycott of fast food chains who refuse to ensure migrant farm worker rights on tomato farms, farm worker-led organizations are essential to abolishing unfree labor. This context is also important because in the US, as attention has grown for what is called domestic trafficking, a term used to describe sex trafficking of US citizens and legal residents, and often cast as modern-day slavery in our own backyard, there is a turning away from what also has always been in our backyards, the exploitation of migrant and immigrant labor. For our discussion, we agreed upon a set of general questions to guide our conversation. We also welcome your questions there in the Zoom audience, and I ask you to use the chat function, and I'll take a look at those questions as we go and give space to those questions as we proceed. So let me give just a very brief bio of our speakers. Sylvia Perez and Uriel Zelaya Perez, who is also serving as a translator today for us, for Sylvia, are from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, a worker-based human rights organization internationally recognized for its achievements in fighting human trafficking and gender-based violence at work. Built on a foundation of farm worker community organizing, starting in 1992, and reinforced with the creation of a national consumer network since 2000, CIW's work has grown to encompass the Fair Food Program, Anti-Slavery Campaign, and the Campaign for Fair Food. We are also pleased to have scholar activist Dr. Annie Isabel Fukushima, assistant professor at the University of Utah's Ethnic Studies Division in the School of Cultural and Social Transformation. Dr. Fukushima has extensive knowledge and expertise in anti-trafficking and human rights, and is the author of the recent award-winning book, Migrant Crossings: Witnessing Human Trafficking in the US, and which is highly regarded across multiple disciplines. And you can see appearing on the side of her screen as well. So I'd like to start by asking our speakers to give just a brief additional information about how you each came to the work of anti-trafficking. And I'd like to start with Sylvia and Uriel and then move to Annie. Thank you.
Bueno, gracias aquí por la invitación que nos hicieron. Pues yo soy Silvia y trabajo con la coalición, pero también, como se mencionamos, también somos trabajadores del campo por muchos años. Ahorita pues hemos tenido esa oportunidad de trabajar con la coalición, pero yo sé cómo es el trabajo en el campo. Y entonces aquí en Imócale, pues por ahorita estamos trabajando con la coalición, que es una organización que fue fundada por trabajadores de Guatemala, de México, de Haití, para eliminar esos abusos que por años pasaba con los trabajadores.
Yeah, so first of all, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to be here with you. My name is Silvia Perez, and I'm a farm worker staff member with the coalition, as was shared. I am now a staff member with the coalition, but I was a former farm worker myself, so I know what it's like to work in the agricultural industry here in our community. To give you a little bit of background to supplement what Jennifer shared, the coalition is a farm worker led, made up of farm workers organization, mostly farm workers from Mexico, from Guatemala, and from Haiti, focused on eliminating human rights abuses that a lot of farm workers tend to face here in our community and the agricultural industry.
¿Les sigo?
Si quiere.
Ok, sí, entonces esta organización empezó con un grupito pequeño, con 6 trabajadores, porque ellos son los que los mismos trabajadores se estaban dando cuenta que no era justo lo que pasaba con los trabajadores, habían mucho robo de salario, golpeaban a los trabajadores y también en esos años pues había muchos trabajadores que eran como sometidos a la esclavitud. Entonces la coalición ha ayudado a 9 casos, que son más de 1,000 trabajadores que han sido pues liberados porque estaban trabajando pues contra su voluntad.
And so, just to give a little bit of background, the Immokalee Workers, as was mentioned, was founded in the 1990s by 6 farm workers. Mostly, these farm workers were trying to address the conditions that they were facing in the agriculture industry. When we talk about conditions, we talk about things like wage theft, gender-based violence, physical violence, and in some of the most extreme cases, cases of modern-day slavery. The CIW has worked with the Department of Justice and FBI to prosecute 9 cases of modern day slavery, freeing upwards of 1,200 workers from modern day slavery conditions through those efforts.
Thank you. Annie, do you want to say a bit more?
Yeah, well, I'm so honored to be here, and thank you. What wonderful folks to be sharing this space with, who do on the ground work in communities and have such important lived experience that are feeding our communities. I just a little bit about me. My book, Migrant Crossings, looks at Asian and Latinos that are trafficked in the United States into informal and formal economies. And so, if you're interested in looking and checking out that book, it takes one through a history of the legal cases and a range of case examples for people to understand what is trafficking and how we witness it today. Other ways that I have connected to this work is that when I was working on this book, Migrant Crossings, as a graduate student, I actually worked in community organizations as a case manager, programs coordinator, working with international migrants and US citizens who had been trafficked in the United States. I also now provide expert testimony and report on immigration, civil, and criminal cases, and have done that for cases in Utah, California, Colorado, Washington, and Massachusetts. And so for me, when I think about the work of my scholarly activism, it really is about the practice of theory and how it shapes our communities. And so I'm happy to be here, and thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. So the first question that we decided to talk about is to really think more about the connections between the experience of historical slavery and contemporary forms of unfree labor. We know, for instance, that with the abolition of slavery in the United States and the failure of Reconstruction, African Americans faced the backlash of white supremacy that doggedly and violently sought to undermine their political and economic rights. That is why the post-emancipation political and economic system produced quite similar effects on African Americans as slavery, notably illustrated by the convict leasing system. The convict leasing system was used by local governments, white farmers, corporations, and it replicated indentured work conditions for African Americans. So-called Black codes, or perhaps more accurately named anti-Black codes, ensured that prisons were filled with newly freed African Americans, a practice still resonant today with the ongoing criminalization of Black life in America. Furthermore, while slavery was abolished, the demand for cheap and exploited labor was not. So US immigration law has a long history of racism and abuse that is relevant to understanding the enduring legacies of slavery here in the US and globally. While systems of migrant labor contracts existed before slavery was even outlawed, our dependence on migrant and immigrant labor significantly deepened after emancipation. The connection between old slavery and new forms of unfree labor thus are vividly displayed in the agricultural industry, a sector directly descended from plantation economies and colonial expansion. So that's just a little bit of background to why we thought it would be important to talk more about these connections. So I'm going to ask you each again to talk some about why you think that it's important and relevant to connect this history of slavery and contemporary struggle for labor rights. And maybe perhaps Annie, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. You did such a wonderful job, Jenny, of offering a more historical, rich context that impacts us today when we think about whose labor is valued and the kind of workers that are protected. And so while we all know that slavery was abolished in the United States, we know that there was conditions and work programs that led to ongoing conditions of exploitable labor. And so we can go as far back to thinking about, for example, Asian migrant laborers who would labor in plantation systems and as, cheap, exploitable, and in slave-like conditions. And so this was, post-abolition as well. And so when we think about the US history economy, it is shaped by three systems, which include slavery, colonization, and racism. And all of this comes together to shape why it is and how migrant laborers experience the workforce even today. And examples of how these systems are enduring occurred with the Bracero program. In the 1940s to the 1960s, contract work occurred between US and Mexico. And so here you start to see how it is the role of the state then that facilitates cheap, exploitable labor. And they were the ones that also set up the conditions of how much workers are paid and so forth, and what kind of work is protected. And so in our US economy, that's just one example. We could take a range of industries, domestic work, restaurant, hotel, and we start to see how it is deeply shaped by racist structures that make it difficult for the working folks who work in them. And so that's just to kind of give you a sense of that. And we see that where in the temporary work visa programs, that now the H visa program that shaped the Bracero program now has repercussions for other H visa programs, where we see other programs such as domestic workers and a range of contract workers who enter the United States also being exploited through these visa programs because they are dependent on their employers. And so that's just to kind of give you a sense of the sort of larger context and to add a little bit to what Jenny offered.
Ok.
Mhm.
Sí, pues todos los que acaban de hablar, pues es muy, muy importante para nosotros y también para ustedes, pues como se está hablando, ¿no? Es muy importante de saber que de dónde pues viene esa esclavitud o quiénes son los que los han enfrentado por años la esclavitud en la industria agrícola, en el tomate. Como mencionamos, la coalición ha ayudado a 9 casos que son trabajadores, no nomás en el tomate, son trabajadores de que han trabajado en la papa, en la naranja, en el frijol, en otras industrias. ¿Por qué? Porque ellos no podían cómo hablar, cómo defender. Entonces, por año, pues esclavitud ha pasado bastante, ¿no? Pero la coalición pues ha ayudado a esos 9 casos que ahora pues han salido a la luz, que son trabajadores, que los tenían, como mencionó acá la compañera, que los tenían pues forzados a trabajar, trabajando contra su voluntad, con amenazas, y la coalición pues ha ayudado a esos casos que gracias a la coalición, ¿verdad? Que ha salido a la luz esos trabajadores que estaban pues trabajando contra esa voluntad. Pero eso es muy bueno porque así sabemos que todavía pues la esclavitud todavía existe. Pasa en otras industrias que tal vez que no sean el tomate, pero que en otras industrias que todavía los trabajadores no tienen cómo hablar, no tienen cómo reportar, no tienen quien les defiende. Entonces, la esclavitud pues todavía existe en otros lugares, pero acá en el estado de la Florida, con los trabajadores del campo, pues eso ya los trabajadores pues ya no sufren tanto porque la coalición pues ya tiene pues la comida justa, ¿no? Que existe en el trabajo. Entonces nosotros vamos y tenemos un librito especialmente donde también se habla un poquito sobre la esclavitud. Entonces, tenemos un librito pequeño, es un librito, pero en este librito está bien sencillo, pero tiene diferentes derechos que tiene en este librito y también explique un poquito que ningún trabajador puede sufrir esclavitud hoy en día en su lugar de trabajo.
Yeah, so just to kind of sum up a little bit of the thoughts that Silvia had mentioned, I think we agree, and Silvia was just sharing how much we agree and how important it is to understand the history of slavery in this country, specifically in the agricultural industry, and as Annie was sharing, right, kind of what that means historically, right? Just because of the elimination of chattel slavery doesn't mean that that entire system and its remnants were completely eliminated, right? We're still seeing its repercussions affect industries today. From our experience, right, as the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, working mostly with farm workers in Florida's produce industry, in the 9 cases of modern day slavery, where we have freed over 1,200 farm workers, we have seen all types of people make up those 1,200. We've seen visa workers, we've seen undocumented workers, we've seen citizens be part of these kinds of cases. We've also seen that it's not just the tomato industry. We've seen the citrus industry, the potato industry, so many different agricultural industries have been found to have some sort of a foot in this kind of exploitation that's happening. Luckily for us, one of the things that we've been able to do is through our Fair Food program, we've been able to work towards eliminating or creating a more just system, eliminating modern day slavery in Florida's tomato industry specifically. As Silvia was sharing, part of the work that we do is we give out these worker to worker education sessions. We give these little booklets. This one's in Haitian Creole. And within this booklet, there is, we educate farm workers about what constitutes modern day slavery, what is forced labor, right? So that they can know what problems, how to address these issues, who to call in case there is a problem within the farms. However, that program is limited in that not a lot of people, not most workers don't have an opportunity to be able to speak out against what they're facing. And so modern day slavery continues to happen today. It's happening in our backyards, like you mentioned, Jennifer, and it's happening in more industries than we care to admit that it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry, go right ahead. Did you want to follow up some more? Okay. One of the things that I wanted to draw out there to help us, move on to another aspect of this is that I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that human trafficking is something that is so utterly hidden because it's illegal and it's happening sort of on the side, or you know, in another place than just where everything else is happening, right? And I think what you were just saying, Sylvia, is, and also Annie, that basically people who have contracts, people who have visas, also are involved in forced labor, right? And so it's almost quote unquote hidden in plain sight, right? It's not hidden, in fact. And at the same time, I think the power of part of what CIW is doing is that when you empower all farm workers, you are servicing, you know, you are doing anti-trafficking work. So I think the question then is, we can turn to this question, which is sort of, you know, what are some of the main causes for this labor exploitation? And how do workers' rights, when we center workers' rights, how can they alleviate that exploitation? Perhaps Sylvia and Oriel, you want to start with that question.
Okay. Sí, entonces eso es muy importante, ¿verdad? De saber esto que por qué los trabajadores pues tienen que trabajar así, ¿no? Aguantar todo eso porque los trabajadores son los que trabajan de primero y entonces vienen los rancheros y luego vienen las corporaciones porque son las corporaciones ellos que tienen mucho poder. Ellos son los que sacan millones de ganancia al año o ellos son también que ponen el precio, ellos son los que vigilen y los trabajadores siempre están hasta abajo, donde el trabajador pues no tiene como un aumento o que al año va a pues sacar como un aumento o le va a beneficiar al trabajador, ¿verdad? Entonces lo que tiene mucho poder son las corporaciones o los restaurantes de comida rápida, porque ellos son los que compran pues todo ese producto que el trabajador pues lo cosecha, ¿no? Entonces, esto es muy importante que las corporaciones que hoy en día están participando juntos, esas corporaciones sí están vigilando que un trabajador no puede como sufrir esos abusos. Hoy en día, pues, cualquier problemita que un trabajador puede enfrentar en su lugar de trabajo, ese trabajador puede hablar, puede reportar. En el librito que le enseñamos ahorita, ahí tienen los números de teléfono, pero hay corporaciones o hay restaurante de comida rápida que todavía no son parte del programa, es donde exige todavía pues la esclavitud, explotación con los trabajadores todavía.
Yeah, so just to again sum up a little bit of what Silvia was sharing, to us in our analysis, our CIW analysis in our industry, the agricultural industry, what we see to sort of kind of highlight what we would call a supply chain pyramid within the food system. At the bottom, you have farm workers, right? Now, and I'm going to stress this because, and this I'm adding because sometimes there's a lot of confusion between farm owners and farm workers, right? Farm workers are not, for the most part, farm owners. They are sort of, again, the workforce within the farms. Some farm workers even work in farms and they don't even know what farms they're working at, right? And so in our analysis, we have the farm worker at the bottom of the supply chain. Right above them, we have crew leaders and supervisors who work for the farm owners, which in our industry are enormous agribusiness, industrial size farms with hundreds of farm workers. And then on top of them, we have food corporations. And it's important to understand the enormous power that food corporations have in the supply chain of agribusiness and the food business. When these corporations come to these farms, they have and I'm adding this, what we would call market power, right? They go and they demand specific quality. They want a specific size of tomato. They want a specific amount. They want a specific order. And they have all of these demands, right? And that puts a downward pressure, right? In terms of these are the demands. The farms must then adhere to those demands. In order to get those demands to be adhered, they then put the pressure downward, right? They get the farm workers to pick the specific color, specific size. Another really important thing is that they drive the price point significantly lower, right? And so what ends up happening is that the farm worker ends up paying out of their own pocket. It drives wages significantly down so that they don't see any real wage increase, or haven't really seen a real wage increase in decades. Even in terms of a yearly stuff, there's no real wage increase. In terms of conditions, they're not being paid more, but they're also being forced to work harder. And so to us, it's really important to understand where that pressure comes from. It's coming from the top big time food corporations. Within our Fair Food program, we've managed to pressure some of these corporations to understand this power that they have and to use this power in a responsible way in order to bring about human rights protections within their supply chains, right? To take responsibility for that. Now, I would add, not a lot of corporations are signing up to do this kind of thing where they're taking responsibility for the conditions within their supply chain. Under our program, we've managed to get 14 of them to do so, but there's still many food corporations that do not want to take responsibility for the conditions within their supply chain. Just as they demand, this is how we think, just as they demand the quality, the size, a price point, they could very easily demand that farm workers are being treated with respect when doing that work.
Yeah, that was so great to hear the work that you're all doing. I just want to add a little bit. I'm going to put a link, and I apologize, it's in English. And so I'm going to put a link to an article that I'm going to kind of reference for folks who are here. But one of the things that I was thinking about in that study, that particular study, was the relationship migrant laborers have to food. The work that fair food programs like CIW are doing is so important. And one of the things that we know is that when we think about trafficking and labor trafficking, is that it occurs on a spectrum from labor violations to full-on exploitation. And so then what you see is that, even before you get at the slavery conditions or slave-like conditions, is that workers may be denied breaks, may have their wages withheld, may not have access to food, and so forth. And so are working and laboring in conditions in which violations are happening. And so one of the things that I wanted to think about was then how they fit in a food system, where food systems are complex relationships among nodes of operations and the things that control them. So exactly what was described, right? And so from production, distribution, and the consumption of food form a chain relationship, right? So those are all the things that form it. And so when we think about when hunger occurs in the context of people, is that it's when food is unavailable, and that there are particular communities that have the right to have entitlements to food, and then those that their rights are not afforded to them. And so these are the things that I've been thinking about, is where human trafficking is part of a food economy. And so what is being described by our colleagues from CIW is this supply and demand, and that as long as there is a demand for cheap goods, then the labor exploitation and the treatment of workers are also then workers are impacted by that, right? And so I just want to describe a quote here from Gene Kinsey to describe a food economy. The entire food chain, from the laboratories that slice, dice, and splice genes in everything from our crop seeds, pharmaceuticals, and animals, to the cream cheese we spread on our bagels. It includes all the familiar agriculture input industries and farm production enterprises that we have studied for decades. It includes a large number of firms that develop ingredients and flavors for the food manufacturers and the two main streams of activities in manufacturing plants, namely food for retail stores and food for food service establishment. It includes a complex transportation and distribution system that sits between food manufacturers and retail outlets, retail food stores, and food service establishments. And so when we think about this food chain, it is so complex and it is huge, and we all live off of it. We need it, right? Because unless if you are growing your own food in your backyard or in your home, we are part of this food system. And I've done activities where drawing upon CIW's amazing work, where I have my students ask, where did your tomato come from? And a lot of them grow their own tomatoes in Utah because there's a whole culture of growing food. But one of the things then I'm like, well, what about, did you ever buy canned tomatoes? What about, did you go to a restaurant, right? Have you ever gone out to eat? And so there's a whole range in which the farm workers are really shaping and helping our food systems, right? They're so a part of it. And so that they're also working on a spectrum though. And so when we think about the conditions of farm workers and those that are on the other spectrum working at the table, it really does go on a spectrum from they may experience violations to full-on exploitation. And those are the things that we need to be aware of and address. And I think that the rights-based work that a lot of organizations like CIW are doing are so important. But it also is, I think, on the consumer to also be aware. And that has been a part of their programming as well, like where we are buying our food. So one of the things I talk about is a matrix of food insecurity. And so I talk about how food is also used as a weapon of abuse in trafficking conditions to coerce, force, and defraud migrants as well. And so I go through 10 kinds of frames in which it happens. And so, you know, from being forcibly fed, being forced to eat in inhumane conditions beyond eating leftovers, to being forced to eat leftovers, food restriction, insufficient food, food denied, food in culturally inappropriate. Culturally appropriate food's really important for workers, right? When you think about what normally goes in your body, food dependency, food is inaccessible, and food being unsafe. And so I mapped out the legal cases in which this happened. And so when we think about the conditions of workers, it is so complex. It's not only the work that they do, but also are they themselves being sustained to be able to work, right? Do they have food access, or are they food insecure too?
Mhm.
So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's great, Annie, and a great addition to the conversation, because it makes the conversation around farm workers' rights more robust than just, you know, our wages, right? That wages is a critical part of it, but it's also about the entire ecosystem, right? Of how our food supply chain, right, depends on different kinds of exploitation. And one question that's popped into the chat that I wanted to ask you all about, because I think it digs a bit deeper into what you all were saying, is, you know, Annie used the word spectrum, right? That there's a spectrum from, not having breaks, or not ensuring breaks, not ensuring, clean water, access to clean water, or healthy living conditions, to perhaps on the other end of the spectrum would be, really extreme cases of slave-like conditions. So the question is, how do you know when you've reached kind of a point in which it's trafficking, right, technically? But then I would actually add, while there's a spectrum, they're all connected, right? It's not just like at one point something becomes trafficking and the rest doesn't matter. We need to focus only on the extreme cases, right? The spectrum suggests that there's also an interrelatedness between all of them. So I wonder if you all could perhaps talk some about that as well.
Maybe I'll go first. Is that okay? So the question is, when does labor violations become trafficking? Well, I mean, that's kind of how I'm hearing it too, is, and what we know is that actually all trafficking conditions have labor violations that have happened, right? But not all labor violations lead to trafficking. And so you can experience a violation, having your wages withheld, and not be trafficked. Happens to migrant laborers all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think that one of the things, though, when we talk about labor trafficking, in 2000, the United States passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that gave us the legal language and the criminal codes to actually define what is trafficking. And so when, a lawyer or a law enforcement agent or a government worker or a social service provider is looking at, is this trafficking? In particular in labor, they're looking at force, which comprises of physical beatings or other forms of physical violence. They're looking for fraud, so a person who was lied about their work conditions or the type of work they would get into. And they're looking for coercion, when a person is threatened, their loved ones threatened, or even animals are threatened, and other species in their lives. And so usually when we talk about trafficking, that is what they're looking for, is that one of those things have happened for that person's labor, or to continue to perpetuate debt bondage. And so it needs force, fraud, or coercion need to be present for it to be trafficking. And it's not to say that you have to be seen as trafficked, but the reason why people do get identified is because maybe it might afford them immigration relief. It may afford them, civil remedies, and it may afford them, if they want to assist in the prosecution of their traffickers. Now, whether or not people come forward is another thing. There's a range of reasons why migrant workers have not come forward and don't always come forward to share their experiences of abuse that even goes in the most extreme, or what's considered trafficking. But I think what you were saying, Jenny, about on the spectrum is really important, is that if we don't address the violations that happen, the everyday violations, then we can't even get to the most severest cases. Those are the tip of the iceberg. Those are the ones that become visible. But what's happening on an everydayness are the violations.
Yeah, I think for the most part, we would defer to Annie in terms of the definition. I think that's kind of a really good way of understanding it. But I think just to kind of highlight a little bit again, just the spectrum element, I wish I was looking at the same time that we were doing this for a graphic that we have here, and I couldn't find it. But here in the coalition, we have a graphic of a tomato plant, right? And on the plant, there's little leaves or sort of branches off of it, right? And there's wage theft, gender-based violence, right? Physical assault, right? And at the root of the graphic, the roots of the plant, there's modern day slavery, right? And so again, it's important to understand that if one of the best ways to address modern day these issues of human trafficking and modern day slavery is by addressing these more visible, I guess, instances of obvious worker rights violations and human rights violations, right? And so if you see that, if something so basic, right, as gender-based violence is happening, and it's happening rampantly, right, in the industry, it's probably you would be hard pressed to think, wow, something worse could happen here. Human trafficking could be happening here. Modern day slavery could be happening here. When you don't see those small issues, if those small issues are being dealt with in a timely manner, and workers actually feel the ability to be able to speak out against a problem, right, and where there is a what we would say a culture of speaking out, not a culture of silence, that's a good indicator that those probably bigger issues are not happening in an industry. So just wanted to kind of mention that as well.
Right. Maybe you could also elaborate some on, and in addition to, as my understanding of the Fair Food Program in part is, and I remember years ago, representatives from CIW visited my human trafficking class and talked about their work trying to get Wendy's, which is, I think, one of the last or the last fast food chain to not agree upon the rights of farm workers working in the tomato industry. And so I wonder if you could elaborate some on specific issues and rights that your organization is focused on that could have this ricochet effect, right? That and that would, be positive within the industry. And so maybe you could elaborate on that.
So yeah, so just to kind of give a quick background around it, I guess the Fair Food Program, again, was a creation and a vision of farm workers themselves saying, what would a fair workplace look like for farm workers, right? When we started the campaign for fair food that you mentioned, Jennifer, in the early 2000s, when everyone thought, wow, could farm workers take on a corporation like Taco Bell and win? Like no one thought it was going to be possible. The three demands that CIW was making was one, for Taco Bell to pay 1 penny more per pound of tomatoes that they would purchase, that penny go directly to farm workers as an added bonus for the work that they did. Today, that has equaled more than $34 million that have gone directly to farm workers through the Fair Food Program, and now it's ninth year of being implemented. The second demand was for there to be a human rights code of conduct created by farm workers themselves, right? Because no one knows what farm workers are facing better than farm workers themselves, right? Within that code of conduct, there was zero tolerance policy for sexual violence and zero tolerance policy for modern day slavery, right? And so what we mean by zero tolerance policy is that if there's a farm where Taco Bell was purchasing from, and there was an investigation and it showed that there was an instance of sexual violence or modern day slavery happening, and Taco Bell would have to cease purchasing from that farm immediately. There was no ins, ands, or buts in terms of whether to do that, right? That puts an immediate market consequence on the farmer and gives them the incentive of, well, I don't want to lose my business to Taco Bell or to McDonald's. So they're going to have an incentive to actually ensure that those kinds of problems never happen. And then the third demand was for workers to have a voice in the workplace, for them to speak freely without fear of retaliation. I'm sure Annie would say this, right? A lot of problems that migrant workers face is this culture of silence, this culture of fear, right? Where there's always retaliation. If you speak up, you're going to lose your job. If you speak up, I'm going to call ICE. If you speak up, always a bad consequences on the side of the worker, right? And so people don't speak up, right? And so it was important for us that if there was going to be a program that purported to protect farm workers, that it needed to protect them in any time that they did raise their voice. Because if they did raise their voice and they found out that there was retaliation, it was not going to be successful. It was not going to do what it needed to do. So that's how our Fair Food Program works, right? All of these 14 corporations that are part of it sign legally binding agreements that demand that there are any abuses happening or any zero tolerance problems like that, they need to stop their purchasing from those kinds of farms.
So maybe a kind of a follow-up to that is just to kind of shine a light a little bit on, so you talked about wages, right, increasing per pound, by 1 penny. You talked about a worker-led and designed set of rights that are enforceable, and an environment, a wider environment in which concerns of workers can be raised. And I wonder where you see the role of consumers. I think sometimes there's perhaps, the idea, like Annie was saying earlier, that people can like grow their own food and somehow, not participate in exploitation by making these consumer choices. But often, those kinds of choices are really about privilege and not necessarily about undermining exploitation. And so I wonder if you could both kind of elaborate some on what you think the critical role of the consumer is in advancing farm worker rights.
Sure.
Sí, entonces el papel de los consumidores es muy importante para nuestra campaña que hemos tenido ya por años, ¿no? Entonces ellos son las personas más poderosas porque ellos son los consumidores. Entonces ellos siempre nos han apoyado en las protestas, en las marchas, en las giras, y también la gente de fe también son importantes para nuestra campaña porque ellos también son consumidores y ellos también han sido parte de esta lucha que hemos llevado desde el 2001. Entonces hasta hoy en día pues tenemos pues el apoyo de la gente de fe y los estudiantes también al nivel nacional de este país para presionar las corporaciones, que esas corporaciones sean parte para que los trabajadores tengan derecho todo, ¿no? Derecho a quejarse, derecho a tener agua, a tener baño, reportar los abusos y también derecho de hacer cualquier queja, cualquier problema que el trabajador podría enfrentar en su lugar de trabajo.
Mhm. Yeah, so I'm gonna say what Silvia said and also add a little bit there as well, given that I myself was a consumer at one point, and still am a consumer, right? So that's one thing you can take out from this event, right? But in our work, in our campaign for fair food, consumers have been of the utmost importance in terms of using their power and their platform to help farm workers pressure food corporations. I would add, and many farm workers would say, if it were just the farm workers alone, it would likely not have been as successful as it would have been. We needed the support of allies and consumers. We call them allies or allied consumers, you know, and two constituencies within there that have been very pivotal really in the work that we've done have been communities of faith and students. Now I'll elaborate as to why. Communities of faith already have a belief on justice, right? On supporting low wage workers, right? On respecting fair wages and respecting those who work the land, right? These institutions also have a moral authority, right? If a church says that this is a moral problem, it has a moral backing. It has a moral statute that helps amplify these demands by farm workers, right? And so when we started our Taco Bell, and I'm adding a lot here, when we started our Taco Bell campaign, we had endorsements from the United Church of Christ, the Presbyterian Church USA, the United Methodist Church. When these enormous institutions that represent millions of people worldwide say, we support your cause, that's a massive way of showing a corporation, wow, there is significant popular and consumer support for this. Maybe I need to do something different about what I'm doing. The same thing goes for students. Students have played a massive role in a lot of our campaigns. I'm elaborating a bit here, but consumers have, students specifically, have seen an important role in a lot of our fast food campaigns because they are one of their target demographics. Students are some of their target demographics for fast food corporations. And so students understanding that they're a target demographic, and a lot of these corporations just think, oh, hey, you know, being funny on social media or having snarky commercials and stuff is enough to get me this demographic. That's not the case. You know, these are college age students. These are people that think, that have a sense of humanity, and that if we tell them that people are being exploited within the supply chain, they're going to respond in an appropriate way. And so that response has looked very, very powerful throughout our campaign. During the Taco Bell campaign, 25 universities kicked out Taco Bell from their campuses as a way of showing support for CIW's campaign. That's a way of hitting them. Sometimes those moral arguments may not reach the heart of these corporations, but definitely hit their pockets. And sometimes hitting their pockets might be more important than hitting their hearts. And so that's one of the ways that students have played, again, an increasingly pivotal role in supporting farm worker rights and understanding the role that they play within this food system.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think that I just want to add a little bit about the sort of significant of the moment that we're in pandemic, and how that has really, I think, impacted a lot of systems and chains, where we see demand for certain things have actually impacted workers in production of meat, you know, in the meat and packing industries. And so when we think about the Defense Production Act under the Trump administration, prior administration, what we saw was that actually a lot of workers were forced to work and labor in unsafe conditions with you know, limited protections or insufficient protections. So the consumer could continue to buy meat. And so I think that one of the things we do have to think about as consumers, where there is no one that is not a consumer, that it, you know, if you go out to eat or at any point in your life, if you're buying seeds, at some point you are part of this chain, right? And even, you know, and so anyways, like there's no one that's outside of it. There's no place of innocence. And so I think that that's just something to think about. And I just love those examples that were provided, because I think CIW is really offering a great way that you can mass organize publics and workers in coalition together to address some of these systemic issues. But I think that their work is ongoing. And so I think that it's important for consumers to continue to follow organizations like this, to support them, even if it's with your resources, because many organizations like this have a lot of volunteers that are helping them, and so then how can we continue to ensure that they continue to exist so that, our food chain system continues to be protected.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I wanted to just emphasize something that Annie just said too, that, I think that one of the things that I'm aware of and a little leery is that, organizations, sort of new organizations that have emerged to combat human trafficking, don't necessarily have or don't always have connections to these long-standing, historical organizations that have been mobilizing for, workers' rights for a long time, and that there's there's an importance to amplifying those organizations just as much, or perhaps even more so, than an organization that perhaps more narrowly focuses on plucking out extreme cases without sort of addressing the systemic issues of racism, of inequality, of immigration abuse that have led to the conditions that allow for something like human trafficking to exist today. And so I noticed that Annie put in a link to the Coalition for Immokalee Workers on our chat. And just wanted to mention that for anyone who hasn't looked at the chat box yet, that you can click on that and go to their amazing website. And I also wanted to give Sylvia and Oriel an opportunity to talk some about their current COVID campaign that, as Annie was saying, it's so important to think about how the current pandemic has had a huge impact on the precarity of those working, our essential workers, right? Not only nurses and people like that, but people who are allowing us to still eat during this pandemic. And so I wanted to give you all an opportunity to talk some about that in that campaign, and thoughts you have about what you're doing right now in the context of the pandemic.
Sí, entonces, gracias por preguntar, y también nosotros pues podemos compartir el trabajo que nosotros hemos tenido desde que empezó pues este COVID, ¿no? Aquí en nuestra comunidad, empezó aquí en marzo el año pasado, como al media de marzo estuvimos aquí también, y como nosotros cada año pues hacemos nuestras acciones muy grandes, parte de la coalición, pero este año no se hizo por el motivo de COVID, que estaba enfrentando bien fuerte allá en el centro de Nueva York, pero también ya después pues vino aquí, ¿no? Entonces, para los trabajadores del campo, pues son más como, están más como, peligran más, ¿no? La vida de ellos, porque ellos tienen que trabajar todos los días, son trabajadores esenciales, tienen que irse en un autobús, en los buses de la escuela. Entonces ellos no pueden dejar de trabajar, no pueden como quedarse en casa o irse separado al lugar de trabajo, porque es un solo transporte pues para llevar 30 personas, 40 personas. Entonces pues son los trabajadores de primero, pero entonces y hemos empezado pues esa campaña, cómo los trabajadores pueden protegerse más para proteger su salud con este COVID que estamos enfrentando.
Yeah, and so, well, first, again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about the work that we're doing with COVID. First, to kind of put into context, our organization, we're always organizing protests and such in our campaign for fair food, specifically now targeting the Wendy's Corporation. Early last year, we were going to organize a march in New York City during March of 2020, which was exactly when COVID really kind of started taking a hit in that city of New York City. And we saw it, become one of the most harshly hit areas in the United States, right? And so we kind of had to put a pause of this campaign work and not take our farm worker community there to protest, because we knew that it was going to hit our community too. And so around late March, early April, we started seeing cases pop up in our Immokalee community. And so we started kind of shifting our work to, we're seeing how can we support our Immokalee community during COVID. It's important to mention that farm workers, kind of like how Annie already mentioned, just like workers in packing houses and stuff, are extremely vulnerable to COVID. Like Silvia mentioned, workers, well, first of all, they don't have the opportunity to just say, oh, I'm going to stop working. And, most workers live paycheck to paycheck, right? So they don't have that opportunity to just stop working or stop going to work. They need to go to work. But on top of that, they are deemed essential workers, right? What is more essential than feeding folks, right? It's one of the most essential things. And so their work needed to continue to happen. And so what we were seeing was farm workers going into the buses, the old school buses that pick them up and take them to the farms. And there's 30, 40, 50 of them in these buses. On top of that, I would add the housing conditions for most farm workers. There's 10, 15 workers in one trailer home. So the opportunity for you to self-isolate is non-existent if one of those people within that home gets sick. And so one of the things that we started doing was really getting into an educational campaign. There was a lot of misinformation that came out in the beginning of COVID, right? In terms of not affecting younger folks or not having to wear a mask. And so we started an education campaign using our community radio station, putting out posters, going to local businesses, educating farm workers about what they could do to best protect themselves from COVID.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Annie, sorry.
Oh, no. Oh, go ahead. Did you want to say more?
I was going to mention a couple of other things, and I know we're tight on time. So, but also one other thing that the coalition did, besides this kind of education work, was actually launch a campaign demanding testing for farm worker communities in the state of Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis in the state of Florida, probably the worst state at handling anything related to COVID, was doing awful job in terms of getting testing, accessible testing in farm worker and rural communities. We had to launch a petition with over 50,000 signatures to finally get a round of testing here in Immokalee that was accessible, that didn't require an ID, that didn't have 20 police officers outside and stuff, making it seem like this was some serious thing, something that was accessible to the farm worker community. Seeing this lackluster response from government officials, we had to look for an organization called Doctors Without Borders, which tends to do this kind of work in third world countries instead of the United States. And they had to come here and do pop-up clinics and do telemedicine and testing here in Immokalee. Today, I know to give some more time, we're continuing to do this work. We're now with another organization called Partners in Health, and we're seeing what we can do to be there for this community now that vaccines are coming. Are farm workers again going to be towards the tail end of receiving vaccines, even though they do an essential job? Well, whatever the case may be, we're there to either support with the efforts getting those vaccines out there to farm workers, or to pressure anyone we need to do in order to get those vaccines to get to them. So,
yeah. I just wanted to add very briefly that when we talk about COVID-19 in our food systems, there's a range of food systems that have been impacted, and that, this sort of, lack of safety for workers is like, we're seeing a lot of the gaps and holes in our system. And I think that while COVID-19 is scary, dangerous, and there's a lot of crises that has happened, it has exposed the limits of some of our systems. And so then I think that one of the things also, when I think about the next steps forward, I do think that addressing how we support migrant workers is really important, and thinking about immigration relief and support for migrants communities in these ways that are more radical than they have been, that is so needed. Because I think that when you look at in all but 8 states, foreign born are the majority of the workforce, right, of essential industries. We know that our communities are being sustained in a pandemic because of migrant workers. And so it's just, I think that's another thing we also really need to have, just to kind of, we don't have enough time to really go into it, but that's something to kind of leave folks with, is that to support labor workers or people who experience labor exploitation on the spectrum also means that we need to support their immigration needs, as well as we need to support the range of things that make us fully human, which includes food access, which includes the right to healthcare, and so forth, in which we know that a lot of the current healthcare system still leaves out a lot of migrant workers. And so, there's a lot of work ahead, but I think that this crisis has really, you know, there's a lot of opportunity in a crisis, right? It's a turning point. And so while it's a lot of work, there's, yeah, I feel like there's organizations like this that we can think with.
Mhm. Absolutely. And perhaps in this moment when more people feel vulnerable, they're more open to seeing the vulnerability that so many people have been living in, the conditions they've been living in for a long time, right? So perhaps maybe the moment is a portal, right? That's perhaps an optimistic thought to end on, but we have in the chat the Immokalee COVID campaign link, and in addition to reading Annie's book and getting involved in the research that she's been doing, following the Coalition for Immokalee Workers campaign, I think is one of the most, if not the most important thing that one could do to want to be involved in anti-trafficking. So I want to thank Sylvia and Ariel, and also Annie, for your time today. And sorry we weren't able to answer more questions, but it's a good start. Great, thank you.